Welcome to Talking to Grandma, a weekly podcast about raising and teaching bilingual and multilingual kids. I'm Dr. Veronica Benavides, founder and CEO of Bilingual Generation, and a Harvard-educated doctora who has experienced losing, recovering, and passing on my heritage language to my children. Whether you're a parent, grandparent, teacher, or someone who simply cares about language and culture, this is a podcast for you. Together with our guests, we explore how to support bilingualism in ways that affirm identity and strengthen community. This season, we've been highlighting stories from our Bilingual Generation alumni, but today we're hitting pause on that series to bring you something especially important. New research is challenging long-held assumptions about what linguistically diverse families truly want when it comes to bilingualism and dual language education, and we knew we needed to share this information with you now. To help us unpack these findings, we're joined by two powerful voices. First, Dr. Conor P. Williams, a returning guest to the podcast. Conor is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and a partner at the Children's Equity Project. His research focuses on expanding equitable multilingual learning opportunities for young children across the U.S. He's also a dad raising 3 kids in Washington, D.C. public schools. And joining us for the very first time is Mayra Valle, founder of Mayra V Strategy and a language preservation specialist with Bilingual Generation. A first-generation college graduate and Gates Millennium Scholar, Mayra has spent the last decade designing educational pathways for underrepresented students. Most recently, she led 6 weeks of transformative sessions with our Bilingual Generation collectives for families in the Houston area, helping them navigate identity, opportunity, and bilingualism with clarity and confidence. In this episode, we dig into what families actually value, why misconceptions persist, and how schools can design dual language programs that align with real family priorities. We'll also explore how issues like accent bias, cultural identity, and family experience all intersect in shaping children's educational journeys. This is Talking to Grandma. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the podcast, Conor, and welcome to the podcast, Mayra. We are here to talk about families and bilingual education, and in particular, the new report from the Century Foundation, What Families Want, New on Public Demand for Bilingual Education. Conor, this is one of the reports that you co-authored, and the report starts with grounding in the state of bilingual education today and the recent attacks on bilingual education. I'd like to start our conversation there as well. And with you, Conor, if you could just kind of elevate, what are some of the shifts that we've seen in our systems and policies, and how have they impacted multilingual learners?
Sure. I want to start with saying that these shifts we're seeing now are very much like echoes of a kind of a unique American pathology. This is a country that is perceived often as very monolingual, very much an English-only country. And there's reasons to people believe that. I mean, at various times in our history, around World War II, at some parts of the country in the late 20th century, we have deeply committed to stamping out languages here, both indigenous languages and the languages that immigrants have brought, whether they be German American, whether they be Mexican American, whether they be from a whole wide range of backgrounds. And also, we have been a country that almost, I think exclusively, more than almost any other developed country, has also embraced those languages at other times, where we have been very thoroughly a bilingual country, a monolingual country, or a multilingual country, a country that passed the Bilingual Education Act over 50 years ago, in the middle of the 20th century, a country that has invested heavily in maintaining, cultivating, and embracing the languages that immigrants bring to the United States. This is something that actually I want to just clarify too. Because I work on bilingual education policy, people often say to me, "Oh, I wonder why the United States can't be more like Europe, where everybody knows so many languages." And yet, when we talk to legislators, to leaders, to administration officials in countries in Europe, they say, we think we could learn so much from the United States because, of course, our immigrants, we don't do anything to maintain their home languages. When we add languages, it's people who were born in France who speak French, adding Spanish, English, German. People in Spain who speak Catalan and Spanish, adding Italian, adding Russian. They don't do developmental maintenance of the bilingualism that their immigrant communities bring. The United States does, however imperfect. So first of all, that's our long history, right? That we've always gone through these cycles. In the last 30 years, we've gone through a couple of complicated ones. About 30 years ago, California, Arizona, Massachusetts, and in other ways, a few other states deepened their commitment to monolingualism. They banned bilingual ed for large numbers of their students. And about 10 years ago, California and Massachusetts pulled back on those bans. So in the last 10 years, and this is really what the report digs into, we've started to see meaningful expansions of public demand for multilingual programming, often in the form of dual language immersion, which is a very specific form of bilingual education. And we've seen public leaders make corresponding investments, right? States as widespread as Texas, as Utah, as Delaware, North Carolina, Illinois, New York, California, all across the country, states have committed real dollars to these things. So that's the backdrop against which this report comes into the world.
Thanks so much for that grounding, Conor. I think it's really important to elevate this comment that you were hearing from others of you study bilingual education. Why can't we be more like Europe? And programmatically, that the US has a lot of really innovative models in terms of supporting multilingual education, simultaneous bilingualism, developing a home language alongside the English language. And a lot of European countries maybe don't have those same type of programs or intentionality around the programs. But having lived in Denmark for 5 years, where everybody is bilingual, at least, if not trilingual, multilingual, I can see that is true. The intentionality behind the programming is not as specific as some of the innovative stuff we have going on in the US. But a major difference is the mindset, is the expectation, is the openness to hearing multiple languages and developing that. And I think that that's something really critical that the report digs into, as well as what are the mindsets? What's the impact of that? How does that facilitate a bilingual populace, or how does that prevent it? And Maida, I want to turn to you in terms of our current state, getting grounded there as well, and hearing from you in your work with families, how have things shifted in the past year in terms of families' feelings around their multilingual identity and their culture?
I think that's a great question. For us, when we visited a couple of the schools in either Aldine or Pasadena, anecdotally, we heard that the country is incredibly divided, right? And we knew this. And I think for me, hearing these experiences on the ground were very shocking to me. At one of our schools, they said parents are even asking neighbors who are documented to drop off students because they really benefit from the dual language program that is available at that school. But at the same time, they were we know 20 to 30 families that have been taken by ICE in the last couple of weeks. So we see communities being targeted and this heightened awareness of speaking Spanish in public spaces because they're wondering, if I do speak Spanish in a public place, am I putting a target on my back? I will say, though, in our conversations, we are noticing that parents still showed up. We were nervous if parents were going to be there, especially because we also got context that a school of 700 students came back with 350 from one year to the next because of these policies that are making families feel incredibly unsafe. And we had a room of families that said, despite all of it, we still see the power of being able to preserve our language of heritage in our household. And so I think we're seeing two stories play out. We're seeing the political piece impact the structure and the systems that our students and families have to navigate, but we're also seeing this persistence where our families still see the power in making those connections with grandma and being able to go visit family members in a different city and being able to converse with them and their cousins. And I think families are having to weigh both of these things at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. I think that elevates and speaks to a lot of our folks who have a more recent connection to their heritage language, a lot of our lived experiences and the complications that our families feel, our parents may have felt around their heritage language. I know, Conor, you mentioned this is cyclical. So I think about my parents who grew up in South Texas when there was corporal punishment for speaking Spanish in a classroom, and how far we've come from there, and how their mindset was well, Spanish can get my children in trouble or put them in a position of not being safe. And yet I still think it's valuable, but valuable enough to risk our safety. Those are real kind of questions that our community is grappling with. Why did you all decide to write this report, do this research right now in this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, two big reasons. One, there's a genuine gap in the field. We actually haven't, for whatever reason, despite the fact that there's all of this political, and I think cyclically political, like xenophobia that drives monolingualism mandates and what have you, things like what we're dealing with at the federal level in the United States right now. And then these cycles where people rediscover and reawaken around the excitement and the benefits of bilingualism. Despite that, and despite the fact that we have this so we have this sort of political controversies, and then we have research certainty that dual language immersion programs are the best way to foster the success of linguistically diverse English learning children. And they don't really hurt anybody else. Like they're generally beneficial when we enroll English dominant kids in linguistically diverse versions of these. But somehow we just never bothered to ask parents. Like there's almost no study saying, hey, check it out. We're going to poll all of you, a couple thousand of you. We have an English only school or a bilingual school. Which one do you want to go to? There's almost no studies on that. There's studies like immigrant families, do you want your language and culture to persist intergenerationally? And there's some encouraging data there. But straight up, should schools help? That we just haven't bothered. So that was like big reason number one, is it felt like this is data that really needs to be in the world. And so we went and got it. Two, though, is, I don't want to say it's personal, but is anecdotal. I visited at least 100 dual language and bilingual schools in the last decade or so of my career. And almost universally, almost every time you go into one of these settings, some teacher or administrator, you'd be talking to them and you say, hey, so like, how did this program come to be? How's it going? They say, oh, well, it's been great. We love all these things. Check out our bilingual lacrosse team or whatever nonsense. And then they say, but we really had a hard time convincing the Spanish-speaking families to come. They just did not want to come. They said, we'll do Spanish at home, you do English at school. And I thought, that's so out of step with the research. And also, as a parent of children who go to a public Title I dual immersion school in DC, that is not what I experience in the community where I live. So all that said, we wanted to know if this was real. So those are the big two reasons. And I want to just underscore what you said a moment ago about the tension in this. The way we set the study up was to do a series of focus groups across the state of California, 2 in LA, 2 in Fresno, and then 2 in Sunnyvale. And 2 because one was in Spanish and one was in English. We did those so that we could then take themes from those focus groups, as you said, the difficulty, the pressure, the tension, even the torture or the trauma that intergenerationally the immigrant communities that we spoke with were feeling, and then test some of the themes that they brought up. So I want to read 2 quotes for you along those lines from the focus groups. So quote number 1, we had a family say, I kind of feel like Spanish isn't really necessary for children to become successful. Yeah, it's good for them to know, but I feel that that's more in their social lives, so they can socialize with people or understand music or sing along or know some funny words or something like that. But in their life or career or something, no. I don't think anybody is going to be like, oh, you don't speak Spanish, you can't work here, or something like that. On the other hand, quote number 2, I think statistically they're smarter because they learned 2 languages and they learned how to implement them, like how to use the words properly, how to apply it to their life in 2 different languages. So I think statistically they're smarter. I feel like nobody has ever said, oh my God, knowing 2 languages makes you dumber. Nobody has ever said that. I don't know why knowing something else wouldn't be a benefit to you. And I think that encapsulates the complication of how people feel. These were all Latino families that we spoke with. Every night we would speak to a majority born overseas Spanish dominant focus group. And then we would essentially go into a time machine. 15 minutes later, we would speak to a English focus group, English speaking focus group, where the majority of the folks in there were appreciably the children, the next generation of that first focus group. So they go, mostly born here, mostly speaking English, and they would say totally different things about language. But they would both sides evince all kinds of complicated feelings about feeling out of touch with their ancestors' culture, with their celebrations and traditions, but also with concerns about what it meant for success and prestige in the United States. So it was really, really powerful.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for reading those quotes and for placing it in a time machine, or I don't know, like my family gathering, like carne asada, having that same conversation at the same table across the generations. So I'm curious, Maida, how that landed for you, hearing those quotes and how you situate that in your context and what you hear within your community and the communities that you work with.
One, I'm fascinated, and I'm so grateful that you brought those quotes in because I think I relate to those, and the family members that I engage with most relate to those quotes as well at different phases of our lives, right? So for me, as a first-generation low-income student on the north side of Houston, Texas, I'm right in between 2 big hubs and very pride-filled communities. And so on one end, on the East Tex Freeway side, it's a predominantly Black neighborhood because it's closer to Northeast Houston. My grandmother lived there. On the other side, there's a big road, which is Hardy Toll Road, And that's where I grew up. And that's a predominantly Latino, mostly first gen, mostly undocumented, intergenerational housing community. And so when it first came down to me figuring out, actually, it came down to my parents figuring out what school I would go to for elementary school, the school that I was zoned to, which was 1 block away, but had a dual language program. My mom said no. And we actually ended up using my grandmother's address and went to a school that was predominantly Black because my mom said at the time, we can teach you Spanish. We want you to learn English well. Her big hesitation was, if we confuse her with both languages, what if she is hindered in the process of getting jobs because she speaks English with an accent? And I don't want that for her. Again, all of these biases that they heard, and they were only in the States maybe 5 to 7 years before having me, but a lot of those historical biases still inform their decisions as parents. And then later on, now that we have a little niece in the family, little cousins, we see the importance of being bilingual because we're seeing that our recipes are getting lost, our culture is getting lost, our ability to tell stories and connect with elders in the family is also getting lost, that we're realizing we're a really close-knit family, but if we can't communicate with each other, there's going to be critical information about who we are that gets lost in translation, literally. And so now we've started to play games like No Sabo, where we have scratch-offs that we raffle off, and whoever wins the game gets the scratch-off or gets a gift card. But this is a way to make it engaging for us to learn because we see the value in it now. And I think it's interesting because we can have those two perspectives in one lifetime, because we're seeing how different the world is and how important understanding the world in 2 languages is. Yeah, and I think we've seen that in a lot of our families where some of them have said, I got punished for speaking Spanish. A lot of our participants have said, I as a parent was punished for speaking Spanish. I still heard it a lot, but I have a little bit of discomfort speaking it in public places or even having the confidence to say, I know Spanish well enough to teach my kids. And so there's some shame connected to that. There's a lack of communication that's happening there. And I think bilingual generation is creating these safe spaces for moms to have these conversations across these levels of understanding and across generations.
Yeah, it's nuanced. It's really nuanced. And I think, an important aspect that I heard in that is that, even though there is this growing conversation, it's cyclical around monolingualism, around English-only policies, there is at the same time another conversation around being proud of our language and where we come from and our heritage, and a growing acknowledgement of the importance of that. And even the research, like you mentioned, Conor, of statistically, we know this. Well, there's a lot of information out there that dispels a lot of the myths that our families used to hear from educators who would say, learning 2 languages will delay or confuse your child. We've had a number of families in our program say they even heard that from pediatricians who maybe still are operating on dated information. So it's nuanced. And Maida, I also just want to double click on the accent aspect of it, because I was at home at my childhood home the other day, and my cousin, my tia were there, and we were all in the kitchen talking. My mom was there, my dad was there, and my cousin, who's learned Spanish as an adult, we were talking about how we wished we spoke Spanish growing up, how much easier it would be, this and that. My dad kind of defended his reason of well, we didn't want you to have an accent, because he had an accent and he understood. But he had an accent up until a point, but he understood how difficult that made his life and felt like learning 2 languages would make you have an accent in English and what that meant. And so I think there's just such a need for, number one, the research to be done to say, let's move past the anecdotes and really understand what's happening. But number 2, to elevate the themes that we're hearing and bring that conversation to light so that we can have some collective healing around this. So speaking of the research, Conor, what were some of the findings? What did you learn from this research once you actually started conducting the focus groups?
Oh, man. I mean, how much time do you have? So, for instance, while you were talking, I looked it up. We didn't actually put this in the report, but we asked, do you agree whether or not people are judged in the United States for having an accent when they speak English? We just asked 1,000 families. 68% said somewhat or strongly they agreed. That was a majority concern, a majority worry of the people in our poll. We found all kinds of other amazing things. One, let's just start with the anecdote that I wanted to test, right? Was it in fact the case that families who were linguistically diverse, who speak a non-English language at home, or families who are Latinos, or families whose child might have been designated as an English learner, is it true that they're resistant to having bilingualism in the school, bilingual education or dual language immersion? And the data are not ambiguous. No, that is not a majority position, not even close. We asked about that directly, and what we found was we said, to what extent do you agree with this statement? Learning both English and another language at home is helpful because it reinforces the language that children are taught at home. So to what extent do you agree with that? We had 64% strongly agree of our bilingual families who speak another language at home. 64% strongly agreed, and another 30% somewhat agreed, meaning 94% of our respondents who were multilingual at home agreed it's actually helpful to have schools reinforce bilingualism. And we weren't necessarily going to just rest on those data. We thought, well, okay, maybe we worded it a certain way. Maybe this was just like a trick of the poll. So we actually inverted the question and asked it again. We said, learning both English and another language at school is not necessary as my children are learning another language at home. Do you agree or disagree? And we found still that was 62% disagreed with that. They said it is necessary. So that's to say that anecdote can be safely put to bed. There just isn't any data in our findings that are even vaguely in that direction. And that's just the opening. I mean, there's so much else to say. When we talked to Latino families, we found that 94% of them said it was extremely or very important that their child grow up to be bilingual. When we asked the multilingual families who I've been talking about, ones who have a kid who speaks a non-English language at home, same thing. 94% said it was extremely or very important that their child grow up to be bilingual. But here's a funny thing. When we asked the monolingual families, the families who told us they only had English-speaking kids in the house, monolingual, only English around here, a majority of them, 55%, think it's important that their kid grows up to be bilingual, which is to say they haven't even started yet, and they want their kid to be bilingual. So I could go on and on. One of the other last findings I'll just flag up front is that we tested on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this. From 1, not at all interested, to 10, it's your favorite thing in the world. Where would you rate bilingual education? The average rating in our poll, 1,000 parents, was 7.9 for bilingual education and 7.8 for dual language immersion. When we asked this question when we posed this rating scale for Latino parents, it was exactly the same. The only difference was that more Latino parents rated it 10 out of 10, max interest, as high as you can go compared to the entire poll. So that's just to say, I mean, we found this over and over and over again. The polling was just unambiguous. Everybody majorities of every demographic group like bilingualism in general. They're enthusiastic about bilingual ed, and they're pretty enthusiastic about dual language immersion as well.
So much good data there, so much to unpack. Okay, but first, Maida, reactions to hearing those numbers. Does it confirm, disconfirm some of your experiences with families around preserving multilingualism and their heritage language?
Yes. In so many ways, I was like, oh my gosh, this totally aligns with my own experience and what we've heard from a lot of our parents in the Houston area, 100%. I think there's we talk about connection a lot when it comes to Spanglish and some biases that parents have around Spanglish. And we see how a lot of these perceptions of Spanglish goes from super negative, we don't really like it, why can't they just speak Spanish the way that it is and English the way that it should be spoken, quote unquote? And then they shift to a space of understanding why developmentally it works really well to build connection with their young person. And so I think to your point, to me, what I'm reading in here is parents want to stay connected. They want to stay connected to culture. They want to stay connected to their kids. And they want to be able to not just connect, but to celebrate this history that they're part of, especially right now where the world is becoming increasingly more polarizing, that for a lot of our parents, for some of them, it's just for me to feel comfortable and connect with my young person. For others that are 2-3 generations in, they're like, I see the power of our existence as resistance so that my kids are able to understand the rich history that they come from. They're able to understand the songs that I grew up listening to. They're able to connect through faith, through education in a way that connects to our culture. I think the conversation around accents really stood out to me as well, because that 68% of families being concerned about having accents is something that we've definitely grappled with as a family. And that's something that's come up in our conversations with our schools. And a perfect example of this is my dad. He's somebody who speaks English really well, but I don't hear it very often. Even with me, there's a level of discomfort because he's like, I think if I speak it, you're going to make fun of me. And there's no data that says that I would. And he knows that it's always welcome here. And we make mistakes speaking Spanish all the time. But I think for him as a man and a lot of these other dynamics with what he's experienced as being a truck driver and a landscaper, I'm sure he's encountered experiences where people doubt his intelligence because he's speaking with an accent. And he's one of the most intelligent people that I know. But I think to your point, there's a concern there. And I fear that from what I've heard, it comes with this sentiment of, are people doubting my intelligence because I don't speak it the way that they do fluently without an accent? And I don't want to run that risk of seeming unintelligent in ways that I can't express myself. So I'd rather not. And I think that's my worry there, that a lot of folks' biases trickle down into the population that speaks Spanish with an accent. And a lot of those biases are grounded in falsehoods, and they're really dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. I also feel like that accent dynamic goes both ways, like speaking Spanish with an accent and feeling shame around that, feeling like I'm not going to put myself out there because I speak Spanish with an accent and don't want to be seen as a no sabo kid. I saw that come up in the research, which is funny. With Conor in the report, I was like, it shows up everywhere. They can't get away from it. I was curious, Conor, in terms of like the overwhelming support for bilingual education amongst families. You did this with Latino parents in California. I would be curious if you did it with other demographics in other parts of the US, if you did it with the Black community. And we talked with Rhonda Broussard, who has talked about the overwhelming underrepresentation and under-enrollment of Black students in multilingual programs, but it doesn't mean that they don't support it, or other communities. I just wonder if, like, in general, like even politically, people think bilingualism is good, despite some of these English-only mandates.
Absolutely. And I want to clarify one thing. The focus groups were entirely Latino families, in part because that was really our focus, and that was the question we were most interested in exploring. But the poll spanned a wide range of demographics. So when I say that on average, respondents ranked bilingual education 7.9 out of 10, that was a demographically diverse poll. And Latinos, it came out more or less the same, except it was just distributed differently. That 35% of our whole survey ranked bilingual education 10 out of 10, maximally interested. 40% of Latinos ranked it 10 out of 10, more maximally interested. So we just saw more enthusiasm for the program from Latinos than the broader sample that was other demographics. I mean, a few other things I'd say. We did have African-American respondents to the poll, and there were some patterns in the data, but I'm not going to share a lot of them, in part because it's just a smaller demographic in California, so we didn't have a huge sample size for this. So I don't want people to read too much into what I'm going to share next. What we did find was, after we asked folks to rank dual language immersion bilingual ed, we then shared some possible benefits of these programs. What is the cognitive or the cultural or the economic or the academic benefit of becoming bilingual? Because as we all know, there's some research about this. And then we asked them to do the ranking again. What do you think of dual language immersion now? And we did see, by the way, that the ranking went up from 7.8 to 8.2, right? So it went even higher on a scale of 1 to 10 on average, which if you're not familiar with statistics, we're getting close to ceiling effects at this point. You can't get something much higher than an average of 8.2 on a scale of 1 to 10 because there's a lot of haters out there. Like, there's just people who don't, you could rank cheese on a scale of 1 to 10. You're still not going to get to 10, even though cheese is delicious. You could rank Dolly Parton on a scale of 1 to 10. Everybody loves Dolly Parton, but it's still not going to get higher than 8 point something because that's as high as averages can go. The point being this: when we gave that messaging and we saw the jump in rating, we did also look which groups seemed to be uniquely interested in raising their rating after reading the benefits, and African Americans were one of those groups. Now, again, I don't want to overstate because it was a relatively small sample in the poll and it was just one question or one series of questions, but it is possible to hypothesize, and somebody should test this at a larger number, that when we see in the United States underrepresentation of African Americans in dual language programs or bilingual programs, there's like 3 possible explanations. One is there's inequities that are preventing access to these programs in some form of system. Maybe they're not put in African-American neighborhoods. Maybe they are dissuaded from coming by administrators who ought to know better or something. 2, there's a genuine lack of interest in these programs from the African-American community in general. Or 3, there's an information gap that families might be interested in this, but they just don't know that much about it. And it's probably some combination of those 3 things. We don't really know. But if, in fact, they are one of the groups that was most likely to raise their rating of dual language immersion after hearing about the good things it can do, that indicates at least it's possible that some of what's happening here, more of what's happening in that case, is the information gap.
Yeah, for sure. That information gap is so real, especially when you put it in the perspective of parental support, because ultimately parents just want what's best for their kids. And I think that language is has been so politicized, right? That like we're not making decisions about our policies necessarily or our school structures solely based on the research of what can be beneficial for kids, but it's a mixture of a lot of things that is, as you mentioned, could be based in xenophobia, fear of others, fear of difference, fear of people not integrating into our society, which, if we pull back that layer even one piece, it's complicated and it's not so straightforward.
I think that's right. One other thing that I want to stress from these findings is that partly because there's such broad-based enthusiasm about bilingualism, bilingual ed, dual immersion, I want to flag what we talked about the last time I came on the podcast. It is important for people to realize that all multilingualism is not created equal as far as the research shows. And what that means is, it is the case that it is good for anyone to learn a language, like that quote we read earlier. Like, nobody has ever said that adding a language would make you dumber. It's impossible. That's just looking at things wrong. It's like saying you get shorter by getting taller. It isn't what happens. However, the research is pretty clear that adding Catalan or Welsh or doesn't matter, Japanese to my English dominant, relatively privileged white kids in DC is not the same project as supporting the emerging bilingualism out of a native Spanish speaker in the United States or in any particular community. Part of what we see in the research is that the benefits of multilingual programming are uniquely strong for those English learning communities, for students who speak a non-English language at home. And that is not ambiguous. That is not like, oh, Conor's just being tendentious here. That's what the research shows, and it shows it repeatedly. In fact, there's even one study out of Utah that shows that two-way immersion, meaning when you have linguistically integrated classrooms, about half the classroom is Spanish dominant, about half the classroom is English dominant, you see strong language development and you see some academic bonuses. But in Utah, in the one-way language immersion classrooms, where it's all English dominant kids and they're just working on French or they're working on Russian or they're working on Spanish, we saw null to negative academic impacts, meaning it didn't actually give us the benefit, which is just to say that when we say there's lots of research on multilingualism being good and there's some information gaps in the field, people need to know that it does actually matter to prioritize the access of non-native English speakers in these programs. That's what makes them work. We don't know that in every case, in every community yet, but that's what the research is starting to suggest.
Yes. Say it louder. Snaps for that.
Sending snaps through the screen, because I think a lot of what you mentioned, for me, it resonates a lot. And I think about historically, right, big cities like Houston, and we're not new at this, they've been historically racially segregated. And so the idea is a lot of our communities don't interact. And in my experience, that just is not the case. Black and brown communities have consistently coexisted, in my case specifically, right? And I think about, I share this story with our participants, but my grandmother had 12 kids on my mom's side, and my paternal grandmother had 9. Most of all of my aunts and uncles live in Houston, and most of my cousins live in the same neighborhood I grew up in on the north side. And so for us, my grandmother, I remember this distinctly in the 90s, she would tell us, we are guests in this community. Because for her, she said, we had been evicted by so many other people because they saw us as a risk. She was a single mom with this many kids. She was like, the Black community was the community that embraced us. We are guests in this community. And so had there been opportunities for that to have been the case, I'm sure we would have thought about things maybe a little bit differently. But I think our communities are already so intertwined that I think if these programs were made more available and accessible to our schools, I wonder what those numbers would look like. And I think in conversations with different trustees in the area, and especially how Texas schools are funded, it's really based on attendance. And a lot of our schools that are most marginalized marginalized have lower attendance than other schools. And so they tend to have less funding. And we look at dual language as an additional thing that costs more money. So some schools miss out on programming that could be really popular if it was made available. And to your point, if information was available, it'd be a game changer, I think.
Yeah, Conor, that was actually, I think, one of the findings in the report is that despite this interest, there is limited access to bilingual or dual language schools in their communities. So could you kind of elevate or speak a little bit more to that point and those findings?
Yeah, I mean, the focus groups, this came up a lot. The thing we heard over and over again, because we said, all right, if you were choosing a school and choosing a dual language school was one of the things that might be an option, but maybe there's also a school with smaller class sizes or a school that's got more robust after school or higher academic reputations or something like that. If you were choosing amongst all these different options, which would you choose? Because we wanted to see, it's one thing to say I'm, 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 interested in bilingual ed. It's another thing to say I'm interested in this very high compared to other possible things we could have. But to ask people about that, you also have to ask them, how would you choose a school? Do you feel like you have a choice? Where do you get your information about schools? And I don't mean to wade into school choice politics because that's a whole toxic nightmare that I'm not going to touch on today. But I will say that one thing came up a lot when we asked about that. We said, do you feel like you have a choice? And a lot of people would say, oh, no, definitely not. There's dual language in our communities, but it is nowhere close to where I live. And so you'd hear that a lot. And what started to happen, which is interesting, almost every focus group you'd hear this, you'd say, well, yeah, we don't have a choice because it's all based on your zip code. It's all based on where you can afford to live. And then somebody else around the table would say, yeah, it is. It's really hard. And, actually one thing, we actually moved one time so that we could get access to a different school. And then somebody would say, yeah, actually. And then my grandmother, as Maida was saying, she lives somewhere that we had a really great school. We really wanted to go. So we just sort of pretended we lived there. And somebody say, I didn't know you could do that. And somebody say, oh, you definitely can, which was fascinating. Especially if you're sitting in a focus group, we were sitting behind the glass, not moderating, and you'd look around and you'd see all of these like researchers with, dorky degrees like mine, and you'd see them kind of like wincing a little bit, like that's illegal, that's attendance fraud. Oh, my goodness. But it's a real thing, right? So in terms of the country, there's absolutely a gap in access. And almost everywhere you go, when dual language starts, you see heavy demand. And you see really large wait lists. Where I live in DC is one of the most acute situations like this. But I was looking at the demographics actually yesterday. If you check the lottery data from the last couple of years for some of the local charter schools that run dual language immersion, but also for some of the district schools that run dual language programs, there are hundreds of kids on the wait list for like 20 pre-K slots per school. And then it's over and over and over, just everywhere, especially in the communities that have large Latino populations, especially in the communities where there's large Spanish-speaking populations. And that's not an aberration. You see that all over the place. As I was saying, at the local level in the focus groups, there's ample evidence that this isn't just a national thing. This is that everywhere where these programs are, people are really excited to go and really urgently trying to find their way in.
Yeah. I feel like we've seen that definitely in the different contexts on the ground. And yet we've still been in some districts where majority Latino, they're doing dual language or bilingual programming. And there still is some information dissemination that's needed about it. Because one of the other elements that you found in the report was families share anxiety about fostering bilingualism, which is real, which we should address. When we're bringing these dual language programs in, this is true. There are wait lists, but I don't want administrators to get the misconception that they're going to bring it in and their programs are going to be, over enrolled, that there will be a wait list, because sometimes we work with families who are enrolled and they're like, I don't know how it's going. I'm worried that I'm not seeing the language development that I want to see, or that the reading in English is not where it should be. Should I, take my kid out of this program and put them in the English only track? And so I think that there has to be an attention to the onboarding of families. And that's a part of what we do in our work with families, is helping them understand what is developmentally appropriate for a bilingual profile for a child that may be English dominant and is in a bilingual program with Spanish English, or who may be Spanish dominant and isn't in this dual language program, because it can look different for both of them. And I don't know, Maida, if you want to speak to some of these anxieties that we heard from families that were most of them enrolled in dual language programs.
100%. I think what was so interesting was that was something that a lot of our families had in common. A lot of them were in, their students were in dual language programs. However, their journeys to the US looked very different as parents. For some, we had a student who had just been in the States for 10 months. For others, we had folks that were 5th-generation Texans. And so the conversation looks very different. And what I really enjoyed about our sessions were that in collaboration, we had the 5th-generation Texan Mexican Americans talking to the recent immigrants and saying, I know right now it doesn't feel like they're absorbing as much as you would like for them to at the rate you would like for them to when it comes to English, but English pretty much dominates the country. They're going to learn it. And I promise you they will learn it. And I think it gave that parent so much ease and it took away so much of that burden from her shoulders because for her, she was just not seeing progress in the way that she had anticipated. And for her, she also thought we're only speaking Spanish at home, so he's getting a lot of that. And at school, they're doing half and half. So right now, we need to up the English a lot more than what we have. And I think at the same time, we've got parents on the opposite side of the spectrum, where to Vero's point a couple minutes ago, where you were talking about the No Sabo students, where 3rd, 4th generation Texans and Mexican Americans are saying, okay, I speak it really well, but I'm not practicing it as much in my household. So my students struggle with conjugating some of the words in ways that proficient speakers or fluent speakers would. And I'm still raising brown boys or brown girls in the States. And I don't want them to be at the grocery store and somebody asks them a question and my young person doesn't know what to reply. They were like, that just seems like it would be so embarrassing. And it would be an assessment on my parenting if we get it wrong. And so in having both of these parents on opposite sides of the spectrum have these conversations, we realize that the conversation is the same. They're hoping for this mixture and this dominance in both languages to happen. And I think they're also realizing that we have to do that with intention because in English, we're having to navigate English-only spaces a lot of the time. And so we're starting to have those conversations around what does it look like to do it effectively or to meet our goals. For some parents, they're like, I think if my student would be able to carry a conversation with their grandmother over breakfast for 30 minutes, that is huge. Other parents are like, I want my student to be able to get a job because they're bilingual. Whatever the goal is, the strategy should match. And I think having these conversations is really helpful for them to do that.
Absolutely. And look, I feel like it's really easy, especially if you're, again, like a laptop dork who just sits around and does polls and is really good at talking about data. And all you want to do is like answer these research questions, say, well, we've just got to get the information out to families and then that'll solve our problem. And that's true-ish. And yet the pressures that you're talking about there are so real. Like no parent is thinking, oh, it's great that my kid feels like they're not hitting their language development milestones. No parent's going to just like sit back and be like, yeah, this is awesome. I'm totally relaxed about this. There's going to be anxiety because these are real tensions. And it's not only that it's a real tension, but because it's so emotional, like watching your kid, especially as little kids, you just brought into the world and you're very, very focused on them. When some person, no matter how much you trust them, no matter how compelling their evidence says, don't worry, it'll be fine. I know everybody else seems like they're ahead of you. It's going to work out. Reaching them in that moment of intense emotional anxiety is really difficult. And so it's just to say that getting the information out there is like a good step. And also we should be very honest about how hard it will be in many instances to get that information all the way through, partly because we did some other polling as part of this project. And what I've been telling people is that we got really high ratings for bilingual ed, for dual language immersion, for bilingualism, but I don't know if we got very strong ratings. What I mean is we did ask about concerns and we said, okay, so how concerned would you be about the possibility the way that languages are taught in school might be pretty formal and might not be as practical for everyday conversations. And that was 70% of our families were at least somewhat concerned with this. We asked a number of other questions about, like, do you think your school could actually deliver this? Or would it mess with your kids to develop in English or academically? And we saw a majority level concern for each of those, which is to say you might be 8, 9, or 10 on a scale of 10 interested in bilingual ed, but that doesn't mean you're not worried. And so I think that's something that we all have to grapple with, that like, I have 3 kids. I know absolutely that what you see every day with your eyes, if that's not feeling right to you and somebody who doesn't know your kid, doesn't know the research, they do know the research, but they don't know your context, comes in to tell you that it's going to be okay when you don't feel like it's okay, that's a really hard sell.
Yes. Yes to that. And I think, a lot of, when you were speaking, Maida, I was just thinking about the incredible work that families put in to preserve our languages and bilingualism. It has been on the shoulder of families for so long. Schools are starting, like our dual language programming and bilingual programming is growing, but historically it has been on the shoulders of our families who have cared so much to do it to the best of their ability. So, number one, I want to name and recognize that, like how much they care, and that's captured in the research and in the lived experience that you mentioned, Maida, and also the importance of when we're maybe trying to operationalize this research and say, like, look, there's a demand for it. Let's just, implement a program, understanding that it comes with emotions. It comes with history. It comes with, experiences and connections. And so, when we work with families around preserving their heritage language, we start with the hopes and fears activity. Like that's, in our session 1 of like, what are your hopes for raising a bilingual child and what are your fears? And I think even just like writing it down, naming it, acknowledging it is a really important step for our families to say that, like, yeah, I am worried about like an accent, or I am worried about like delays in English, or I am worried about X, Y, and Z, so that we can just elevate a lot of these things that have been left to the home front for an individual family to deal with and to make sense of on their own.
And Vero, I think in working with bilingual generation, I even checked my own biases because I thought, okay, we're going to be in a room and there's likely going to be English and Spanish speakers in the room. Great. Little did I know that there were women, and it was mostly women that we worked with, matriarchs that are pillars of their households, their wives, their sisters, cousins, neighbors that are doing the best that they can for their children, but also taking on the responsibility of children in their neighborhood. And Spanish is just one part of the languages they navigate. We've met families that have children that are deaf, that are speaking both ASL in English and in Spanish and figuring that out. Parents that are indigenous that say, we're not just having to preserve Spanish in moving to the States, but we're also preserving Zapoteco and Mixteco. And we also have parents who have children that are on the spectrum. And for them, speaking, period, is a big goal for them. So they're like, every morning, what we just start out with is buenos dias. If they can respond with buenos dias, that's progress for us. And I think in working with bilingual generation, what's been helpful is that a lot of what we see in dual language programs at schools tend to be seen as closed practices. We don't know what the teacher is doing in the classroom. We know it's effective and we trust it, or we don't, and we're excited to see where it goes. And for them, I think this is peeling back some of the layers on the pedagogical front, on the ed front of how can we take some of those strategies my students are learning and create parallel systems in our households that help me not just extend it to Spanish, but extend it to Zapoteco and extend it to ASL. That I think for me, that's been the most fruitful part, that I've checked my own biases because our parents are bringing so much to the table and Spanish is just one part of it,
Truly, truly, yes. And I think just the power of them being in conversation with one another, because some of them are learning so many new things from this work. And others literally have said, I'm doing a great job. Like, this is just affirming everything that I'm doing. And I'm like, yes, you are doing a great job. So we have, that existing wealth of knowledge in our communities. Well, this has been such a fruitful conversation, really hopeful one. I'm really excited that this research, this work is being done. And on that note, I'd love to end with, what is making you hopeful in bilingual education today? And Conor, I'll start with you.
I'm going to be just lame. I'm a father of 3. Like I said, my oldest is 14 now and has been becoming multilingual for 8 years, maybe 8 to 14 years. His mother speaks Welsh of all things. And this guy's getting close to the seal of biliteracy at 14. Meanwhile, my 6-year-old, who is 3 years into his Spanish-English journey, is starting to just kind of throw Spanish in around the house. He speaks Spanglish kind of casually and mentioned that he translated for a new kid in his class who only speaks English the other day. And I couldn't believe it. So that makes me feel great.
That's awesome. And I love that you said becoming bilingual. I don't know why that just kind of made me think of Michelle Obama's Becoming, where like it's a process, right? Bilingualism is a process. We are becoming bilingual. And I still feel like I'm on that journey as well. So thanks for sharing that, Conor. Maida.
I love it. I think for me, what's making me hopeful is since getting into my mid-30s now, I'm thinking of like, what is my role as an elder in my own household to preserve bilingualism? And I think a big part of it is just learning more information, but then two, figuring out ways to make it fun for the little ones, because they get really frustrated when they don't know a word over another word. And so right now, what's working really well is external motivators, where we are raffling things off. We are doing some friendly competitions. Whatever gets them through the door has been really helpful. I think for a long time, I wondered, what is going to be the thing that like helps us connect so that they see the fun engagement before they see the challenge. And it's been working really well. One of my little cousins just won the competition of No Sabo, and she won a $15 gift card, and she's 6 now. So right now that's working, and we'll see what happens in the next phases of things. But so far, we're getting really creative. The family's really supportive. And I think we're just creating more avenues of connection through games and through conversations that I think are landing really well so far. So I'm hopeful for where this goes.
Yay! Yes, for the extrinsic motivators that I'm sure are paired with intrinsic motivators as well.
Correct. Hopefully.
And you mentioned the Yosabo game, which is so fun. We've had the creator of that on the podcast, so we can link that in the show notes. It's a really fun game to promote bilingualism and language development grounded in our culture. And then there is the Yosabo, like early childhood line of games and books, which also makes learning really fun, leaning into our culture. We've had the creator of that on our podcast as well, so we can link that in the show notes. So excited to have this really important conversation. Maida, a first-time guest on the podcast, and I'm sure will be a repeat. Conor, our first repeat guest. So congrats, you get the award, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you liked what you heard, take a minute to share this podcast with a friend or colleague. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Your ratings and reviews help us keep the lights on. We can't do this without your support. Every subscription, share, follow, download, and review make a big difference and helps others find us. Also, we love hearing from you. Tell us what you think of the podcast. Email us at hello@bilingualgeneration.com. You can also slide into our DMs on Instagram @talkingtograndma. If you're interested in learning more about our workshops and curricular tools for schools serving multilingual and emerging multilingual students, visit our website at www.bilingualgeneration.com or write us at hello@bilingualgeneration.com. Talking to Grandma is owned by Bilingual Generation. The artwork for Talking to Grandma was created by Nancy Guevara. Jen Vargas Pressman is the co-host of this show. And I'm Rebecca De Leon, editor, producer, and co-host. See you in the next episode.